the colours of Cornwall have meant an enormous amount to me. I think that probably those colours which I saw without knowing what I was seeing, that very, very blue, almost Mediterranean side, because our house was overlooking St Ives Bay, and you know how beautiful it is. So you've got all that wonderful blue, the extraordinary luminosity of the area, and then on the hills and moors, there was this wonderful gorse colour, and that was what I was brought up with.
George Lloyd was born on the 28th of June in 1913. The house where he was born overlooked St Ives Bay. It was called St Aya. It had originally belonged to a prominent artist, Julius Olson, who had built a very large artist studio in the house. George's father, Will Lloyd, had a great knowledge and love of opera, particularly early Italian composers such as Cimarosa and Pergolesi. This was to influence the compositions of George Lloyd. George's father was a fine flautist. His mother played the violin. The art studio was converted into a music studio, and from an early age George became familiar with chamber music, which he heard performed so often in the music room.
And you could get quite literally a small orchestra into this great studio. And when my father came back from the wars, every weekend people gathered together, and there were trios and quartets and everything. So I just grew up with that around. I grew up with chamber music, and I used to creep in and hear all this. All my formative years were listening to chamber music.
George's childhood was dogged by ill health, and he missed out on formal education. From an early age, George suffered from rheumatic fever, and as a result did not go to school. He stayed at home and had no formal education until he was 12. Confined to his bed for long periods, he would gaze out to the sea from his bedroom window. The sea was to have a major influence in his symphonies. He would write his first 3 symphonies before the age of 20, and have all 3 performed shortly after that.
All of a sudden, later on, I never wanted to listen to any more chamber music at all because I was seduced, quite literally seduced by the soprano voice and the tenor voice soaring above the orchestra, and I wanted plenty of brass and drums and no more chamber music. Right from the early days of being a student, my family used to really laugh at me because they said Otello was my Bible. I never went anywhere without Otello. I just adored that score. And also, another thing, my father couldn't play the piano for toffee. He used to sort of play with 4 fingers. But he could do enough to play the tunes out of Trovatore. So from being a very small boy, I would hear him playing Trovatore, Traviata, whatever it was. So I got all those tunes in my head in the early days. So it wasn't just Mozart and the classics.
George started playing the violin at the age of 5 and writing music by the age of 10. At 14, he had already decided that he wanted to be a composer. At the age of 15, George moved with his family to London to take up his musical studies. He was determined to follow his ambition and become a composer. George studied music at Trinity College. There he was taught by Albert Salmons, England's great violin virtuoso at the time. He studied harmony, composition and counterpoint with some of Britain's finest musical teachers, one of whom was Harry Farjan, brother of the poet Eleanor Farjan.
George's father, Will, from a very early age, he would instruct George. From the age of about 14, he would teach George about how to write opera, and he'd do it by taking a scene from a usually an English play, say Restoration comedy, and he'd give it to George and say, right, you go away and set that scene to music. And George would take it away and he'd bring it back, and Will would say, yes, well, that's okay, but look here, look how Puccini did it, or look how Verdi did it, or see how this was done here and how this was done there. And he'd learn about constructing character through the voice and the dramatic parts of opera, how to get people on, how to get them off, how to build a climax. From the age of 14, he was doing this regularly, week in, week out.
Whilst in London, he spent many hours at the opera, at the Old Vic, and Covent Garden, which performed a series of Italian opera every summer.
He was already quite a seasoned opera writer, even though he never had anything performed. So, and his father would take him to the theatre. I have here some programmes. This is just a small selection of programmes. This is over a period of a year or two. Turandot, Otello, Turandot again, Manon Lescaut, Norma. Now, Norma was a particular favourite because it was Bellini, and he knew a lot of Bellini. Otello again. Sometimes they'd go to the same opera 3 times in a week because he was obsessed with it. So he knew a tremendous amount about opera, and once he got opera into his blood, as you might say, he sort of lost interest in everything else. He wasn't interested in symphonies, he wasn't interested in chamber music, he just wanted to write opera.
It was at this time that Walter Barnes, a close friend, founder of the Penzance Orchestra, and George's father, Will Lloyd, persuaded him to write his first major work, an opera, which was to set him on the road to success. George's first opera was conceived within a year. He had written this fairy story in 3 acts, based on a Cornish legend. A group of Celtic fairy creatures are turned into stones, called the 9 Maidens, by an early Christian priest for dancing on the Sabbath and taking mortals as their lovers.
We went down to Cornwall, to Zena, and I wandered around the moors, and I looked at the stones, and I saw everything, and everything was very, very vivid to me. I used to have a funny sort of feeling about all those stones. Somewhere near the beginning of the opera, the hero, Geraint, he says to the baritone, almost these stones seem to have life for me. I really felt the same sort of way, that there was something very mysterious up there on those moors. So I wandered around and I collected my tunes.
One of the stones comes to life after many centuries and revels in the dawn of a new day. Then, seeing her empty place in the circle, she recalls what happened to her and her sisters and the curse that was put upon them.
I really lived and breathed this opera, you know, in a way perhaps I've never done with anything else. It was really part of me, and all that very unconsciously, which I think gives a certain vivacity and a certain something to it. For me, the power should be with the singers. This was what I was trying to do in all these operas. Right from the very start, I was trying to express the drama through the voice, not just through something in the orchestra.
Outcast am I beyond man's law, rejected by the world.
The ancient stones were to inspire George throughout his life. Eonin, one of the 9 maidens, would become his spiritual muse. George's opera was premiered on the 5th of November 1934 at the Pavilion in Penzance. George conducted the orchestra. He was then aged 21. The producer was Sidney Russell, one of the producers of the British National Opera Company.
The most important person who did come, and that was where we had our second piece of good luck, having roped in a very good producer, Frank Howes, who was then the principal critic of the Times, and at that time the Times really did count for something. And he was down there on holiday, and he came along to this performance, and he gave us the most fantastically good review.
Frank Howes hailed it as spontaneous, melodious and dramatic, an astonishing grasp of the principles of music drama, an extraordinary achievement. Evening opened in London at the Lyceum. The most prominent musicians and composers of the day came to the performances. John Ireland, Thomas Beecham, and Ralph Vaughan Williams among the many.
I was not a lover of Vaughan Williams at that time. Since then I've grown to admire his music, but at that time I didn't like it at all. So he marched in, with his great big black farmer's boots on. He walks in and he says, "'Tisn't fair, I've been trying all my life to write opera." So we had a lot of fun.
John Ireland wrote, "Having heard the opera twice, I have no hesitation in saying that it is quite the most remarkable work produced by an English composer in the last 20 years, whether in an opera or other musical forms."
The audiences were getting bigger, and then all of a sudden there was a most devastating heat wave. And in those days there were virtually no tourists coming to London. At that time, if it got very, very hot, as it did, well, nobody went to the theatre, and there were no tourists, so the theatres just closed, and that was the end of that.
His first symphony, number 1 in A, which he wrote when he was 19, was premiered in 1933 in Penzance and performed by the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra, with George himself conducting. A second symphony had its premiere in Eastbourne in 1934, and that was followed immediately by a third symphony performed by the BBC Symphony Orchestra.
So then I set to work and I wrote The Surf, and that was a serious, very serious, deep sort of a thing, and it was all a bit too much for me, and it was badly produced, and that's another story.
George's next opera, The Surf, was composed when he was 25. His father, LLoyd, wrote the libretto, which he based on the story of a rebellion during the reign of King Stephen. It was performed at Covent Garden in 1938 and conducted by Albert Coates. The opera was well received, but badly produced, partly because Coates was suffering from ill health at the time. Then, just as George's career as a composer was establishing itself, his life took a dramatic, downward turn. The Second World War broke out, and George was one of the few composers to join the armed forces. He enlisted in the Royal Marine School of Music to play the cornet and served with the crew of HMS Trinidad. The Trinidad was a new ship, being rushed through completion at Devonport Dockyard, and George was commissioned to write a march for the ship, the Trinidad March. Lloyd and his comrades were soon patrolling the Arctic. It was intensely cold and dark, and they were constantly dive-bombed by German aircraft or attacked by destroyers and submarines.
You have incredible storms up in that part of the world, absolutely incredible. The cold is intense. They used to say that if you did find yourself in the drink, you lasted 30 seconds. That was all, the cold was terrible. And then, of course, the Germans were just waiting at the North Cape, so they just waited until we came along. And we were doing the Arctic convoys. And they were always very difficult, a tremendous amount of loss. And there was a bit of a scrap one day, and the ship was hit. Well, on one side of our position was the magazine, and on the other side were the oil tanks. And the oil tanks were broken, and down came all this oil. And most of the people were just drowned in horrible, thick black oil. But I was a lucky one, and somehow or other I survived. We had to climb up these ladders with all this oil coming down, and I think the exertion of that or something, it just burned out my nervous system.
Many years later, long after the war had ended, George's musical compositions would reflect the horrors of war that continued to haunt him for the rest of his life. He was taken to a military hospital in Aberdeen. He was very close to death. His lungs were contaminated with oil, and he was highly traumatized with shell shock. The doctors had given up all hope of his recovery because, as George described it, he was just one lump of jelly. It was recommended that he be institutionalized for the rest of his life.
And when George said he was like a lump of jelly, it's because he had a kind of tremble. It wasn't a fine tremor. It was like a muscular convulsion. It was like this, and this would come on him sometimes without warning, but usually when he was reminded of the events that had happened, it would bring on this trembling and shaking, and that stayed with him for quite a few years.
His wife Nancy refused to accept their findings and took him back to live with her family in Switzerland, to the place where they had first met and fallen in love in 1937. The first time George had met Nancy, she was standing behind him.
So I opened the door of the dining room, and here I see her huge back. George was big, and a mop of hair going upwards. And I just said, "Hello, George." And he said, "Hello, Nancy." And I said, "How do you know I'm Nancy? You haven't turned round to look." "I just know," he says.
He was right. It was Nancy who nursed him and brought him back from the brink of death. She was his muse, like the other muse, Eonin, one of the stone maidens who had inspired him to become a composer. In Switzerland, the beautiful scenery and the peace and quiet revived him, but it did take him years to recover. Slowly his mind began to clear, and he started writing small tunes, and eventually he wrote his fourth symphony. George and Nancy moved into rooms in a barn overlooking the shores of Lake Neuchâtel. It was here, in a simple room overlooking the lake, that he wrote his Fifth Symphony. The symphony reflects his recuperative spirit and contentment, and is one of the most joyful of his symphonies. As George remembered, it was one of the hottest summers on record, and the 5 months that we spent at the lake, which was teeming with birds, was probably the happiest of our lives. The colours of the deep water of the lake were extraordinary. We seemed to be enveloped in an atmosphere that glistened from sunrise to sunset, and I believe something of that got into my writing. In 1951, George was commissioned by the Arts Council to write an opera for the Festival of Britain, alongside works by Benjamin Britten and Ralph Vaughan Williams. The opera John Sockman is about an English archer who returns from the war with the French at Agincourt. His father, LLoyd, wrote the libretto. George saw this as an opportunity to re-establish himself as a composer, but the production was full of difficulties.
Everything went wrong with that. Also, for 1,000 different reasons, everybody was fighting everybody. My health was still very bad at that time, but I managed to produce the score, and I was totally, completely exhausted. And so I said, right, finished.
After the failure of the opera, George's life fell apart. He was not mentally fit to return to composing. The pressure on him to write the opera in 2 years was too much too soon. His father died during this time, and the public was not interested in his music. He left the tranquility of Lake Neuchâtel and returned to Britain. Disillusioned, he turned his back on the music establishment and chose to live in obscurity.
We had a little tiny cottage. It had no water, it had no electricity, it had just about nothing. You know, it was just 4 bare walls, which was where I wrote this opera. But we had a patch of land. And in my madness, I said, well, if it's no good in the musical world, I'll have to earn a living somehow. I'll grow things.
George and Nancy set to work. They took over a market garden near Sherborne in Dorset. At first they did general market gardening, then specialised in growing carnations.
We learnt by experience. It was very, very hard work to start with. People have said to me, surely it was rather a waste of time you doing all that. And I said, no, not in the end, because I got my health back.
To stay working as a composer, he had to get up very early in the morning. He'd get up about 4:30, do a couple of hours' work on his music scores before he'd go off to town to pick up the boys to come and help with the garden. So he produced a lot of music in that time, but by working 2 hours every morning for months and years.
George sent scores of his symphonies to the BBC, but they were returned unmarked. But George carried on composing. The creative spirit never left him through those dark, barren years in the wilderness.
I did my Sixth Symphony, which was quite a light thing, and that's a rather curious thing. I suppose I was just about as desperate as I'd ever been at the time, and yet this Sixth Symphony is one of the lightest, gayest things.
And he'd send the music off to the BBC, but they wouldn't play it, because the fashion had changed. That's all it was. Before the war, he was a big shot. Now the agenda was modernism, and William Glock and Frank Gillard at the BBC, they didn't like his stuff, and that was that. He tried to argue with them, he criticised them, the way they selected their pieces to be played, and there was very heated correspondence, but eventually he just gave up. He knew the wind was against him, and he said, okay, if that's how it is, I'm not having anything to do with it. I could do without the BBC, thank you. So he walked away.
Nevertheless, George was not entirely without supporters, and a few contemporaries recognised his talent. Among those who championed his music were the conductors Charles Groves and Edward Downes, and the pianist John Ogden. During his Market Garden days, George happened to hear John playing the piano on the radio in 1962, and was struck by his virtuosic yet expressive style of playing. Within 2 years, John had premiered George's first piano concerto, Scapegoat. Up to this time, George admitted he never much cared for the piano. He didn't really like it. But his wife loved the instrument, and she encouraged him to write the concertos. The two musicians struck up a lasting friendship, and Lloyd composed An African Shrine for him. John would often stay at the cottage, and from 1967 George gave him lessons in composition. It was John who was instrumental in making sure George's music was finally accepted by the BBC.
One day he'd been down to see me, and he went back with 2 or 3 of my symphonies, and unbeknownst to me, one of these got sort of slipped through the net. The first thing I knew was that the BBC wrote to me and said that in due course they would play my 8th symphony.
During his years in Dorset, George composed 3 piano concertos, various novel piano pieces, and 4 more symphonies, beginning with his 6th symphony. Eventually, in 1973, George and Nancy were able to sell the Market Garden at a very good price and moved to London so that George could spend more time composing. They bought a flat off Baker Street. Just before the move, the BBC accepted his 8th symphony, but it was not recorded until 8 years later, when the BBC finally broadcast it in Manchester, with Edward Downes conducting. George and Nancy had raised the funds for the recording. There was a huge response from the public, and letters came pouring in.
So I said, well, it's now or never. I'll have to get myself off my seat and see what I can do.
George did the rounds of orchestral managers with no success until the manager of the Philharmonia Orchestra, Gavin Henderson, decided to put on a concert at the Royal Festival Hall where they would perform the 8th Symphony. And recorded.
And lo and behold, that actually happened. Then he managed to persuade BBC to do my 5th Symphony and my 4th Symphony. And then all of a sudden, people's attitude changed completely. He's had a symphony recorded. He's had 2 symphonies recorded, 3 symphonies recorded. And after that, it sort of snowballed.
It was around about that time that he suddenly got into brass band music. And that started after he wrote a piece for brass called In Memoriam, a beautiful, slow brass piece after the boys and the Royal Green Jackets were blown up in Regent's Park by a bomb. He wrote a piece for them, and that developed into a larger brass piece, and then suddenly the brass band world started to take a bit of notice of him. And before long he had a commission from the National Union of Mine Workers to write for their national championships, and he wrote a piece called Diversions on a Bass Theme. And then the brass band world really took notice, because that was a very fine piece. It's still used regularly. It's used this year as a test piece. And he got also more commissions. He was commissioned by the Norwegian brass band, the Dutch brass band, Belgians, the British Open, the British National, and he had a really good, strong relationship with the brass band movement. They liked him, he liked them, he had a lot of respect from them, and commissions, of course. Money was important. He needed these commissions to keep recording his music.
This was followed by more radio recordings with Edward Downes conducting and more records. George was finally gaining recognition for his work. Within 10 years, he recorded almost everything he had ever written, including his first recordings of his opera, Ian. George had faithfully followed his muse, and the stone was springing back to life to reward him. His recordings appeared in the classical top 10. In 1979, George wrote what he considered to be his most advanced and original work. It was a cantata called Per Vigilium Veneris, or The Vigil of Venus, performed by the Welsh National Opera and conducted by George at the Royal Festival Hall in 1989. These rich and fanciful verses, dating from 200 AD, were turned by George into exuberant choral pieces, a spring song, a love poem, the creation itself.
Something comes into my head and I see either a colour or a sound or something like that, and that gives me the clue. I just get a feeling of some sort, and then the notes come along after that, and I try to organise them to express this idea, which I can't put into words.
So after the Per Vigilium was made, that was the Decca record company, we got signed up with an American outfit. We started an association with the Albany Symphony Orchestra. The president of the Albany Symphony Orchestra was Peter Kamani, and he had an enormous knowledge of 20th century music, and he'd started programming interesting new work with his orchestra, and he sent his vice president, Susan Bush, over to London, and she listened to George's symphonies at the British Library. She heard the audio, the LPs they were then, from the Lyrita label, and she took them back to America. Peter Kamani heard them and said, right, we like this, we're going to sign this guy up. So she came back to London, went to see George, and within 2 hours it was all finished.
George had started on his 11th symphony, trying to expand the orchestra with new colours. and incorporating new instruments like the flugelhorn and the euphonium. He was asked to compose a new symphony for the Albany Orchestra, New York State. So they agreed that this partially composed piece could be included in the new commission.
And then I went over there last year and did 2 concerts with them. I'm going back there this year, and we're going to do some more recording. So I love it over there.
George was now travelling the world, to America and Hong Kong, conducting and writing his own music. His symphonic mass, premiered at the Brighton Festival in 1993, was chronicled by the Gramophone magazine as one of the finest pieces of English choral music writing of the 20th century. Towards the end of his life, he suffered from heart problems, but completed his last composition, a requiem, 3 weeks before he died. He inscribed the score, written in memory of Diana, Princess of Wales. George's deep love of the Cornish landscape and his fascination with ancient stones were a significant influence in his musical compositions. He wrote his music from the heart. He said, "So many people have no religion, no spiritual outlet, so they go for music. They're desperately searching for something to feed their souls. I often get letters from people who tell me they've had trouble, even tragedy in their lives, and that they hear my music and feel better."